The restaurant was loud with celebration, the kind of noise that comes from too many glasses clinking and too many people pretending happiness is effortless. White tablecloths, gold-rimmed plates, soft piano music, drifting just loud enough to sound expensive. My graduation dinner. My parents insisted on this place. They said it was appropriate. My mother stood slightly from her chair, tapping her glass with a spoon. Conversations nearby slowed. Heads turned. My sister, seated across from me, lifted her phone before my mother even opened her mouth. The red recording light blinked on. "This is from all of us," my mother announced, smiling wide, her voice carrying across 3 tables. "For your graduation." She slid a cream-colored envelope toward me. Heavy, thick paper, not a card. I knew that before I touched it. The moment my fingers closed around the envelope, something in my chest went very still. I looked up. My father nodded once, the way he always did when he thought he was about to teach a lesson. My sister tilted her phone slightly, angling it to catch my face. She was enjoying this. Inside the envelope were not congratulations, not pride, not love. They were disownment papers. Formal, typed, signed, prepared. I didn't cry. I didn't gasp. I didn't do any of the things they were clearly waiting for. And that more than anything unsettled them. They believed this moment would break me. They had no idea it was already too late for that. I was still holding the papers when the waiter arrived with champagne flutes, unaware he had just walked into a family execution disguised as a celebration. My mother sat back down slowly, her smile never leaving her face, as if this were still a gift I simply hadn't unwrapped properly. Around us, other families leaned in toward each other, laughing, congratulating their children, toasting futures that were supposedly bright and uncomplicated. My father cleared his throat. He always did that before speaking in public, a practiced sound meant to command attention. "We believe in tough love," he said, loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let someone struggle." My sister zoomed in with her phone. I could see my reflection in her screen. Calm, pale, focused, not the breakdown she'd hoped to post later. Tough love, that was their phrase. They used it every time control slipped through their fingers. When I didn't choose the major they wanted, when I didn't take the job my father lined up through one of his friends, when I didn't smile politely while my sister was praised for things I had quietly accomplished years earlier, my mother reached over and placed her hand on top of the envelope, as if to claim it again. "We didn't come to this lightly," she said, her voice soft but performative. "We've discussed this as a family." A family. Interesting choice of words, considering the document in my hands stated in clear legal language that I was no longer part of one. My father continued explaining clauses and consequences as if he were presenting quarterly results. Removal from financial support, removal from family trusts, formal separation. Everything was written. Everything was signed. Everything was final. I noticed something, then something small but sharp. A date at the bottom of the first page. Not today's date, weeks earlier. This wasn't an emotional reaction. This was a plan. Across the table, my sister adjusted her posture, crossing her legs, phone steady in her hand. She nodded along to my father's words, occasionally glancing at the screen to check framing. This wasn't about me learning a lesson. This was about documenting power. People were watching now, not trying to hide it. A woman at the next table had stopped eating entirely. A man across the aisle stared openly, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth. I wondered what story they'd tell later. The ungrateful child, the harsh parents, the awkward scene they were relieved wasn't theirs. My mother squeezed my hand gently, just once. "You'll thank us someday," she said. That was when something inside me shifted. Not anger, not sadness, clarity. I saw every moment I'd brushed aside, every holiday where my achievements were summarized in a sentence before the conversation moved back to my sister, every decision that had been framed as concern when it was really correction. I wasn't their child, I was their project, and projects that don't meet expectations get discontinued. I unfolded the papers fully and scanned them again, slower this time. My father mistook that for hesitation. He leaned forward, ready to deliver the final blow, the line he'd practiced in the mirror. "This doesn't mean we don't love you," he said. "It just means we won't support choices that embarrass this family." Embarrass. There it was, the real word. My sister's phone trembled slightly. She must have thought I hadn't noticed. She was waiting for tears, waiting for raised voices, waiting for something dramatic enough to justify the cruelty of the moment. Instead, I folded the papers neatly. Once, twice, precisely. I slid them back into the envelope and placed it on the table in front of me. "Thank you," I said. The word landed heavier than any accusation could have. My mother blinked. My father stopped mid-breath. My sister frowned, lowering her phone just a fraction as if checking whether the audio had cut out. "For what?" my mother asked. "For putting it in writing," I said calmly. "And for doing this publicly. It saves time." I stood up. The chair legs scraped loudly against the floor, drawing even more attention. My sister finally lowered her phone completely. This wasn't the ending she'd planned. "You're being dramatic," she said, her voice tight. "Sit down. This is a conversation." I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized how little I felt. No jealousy, no resentment, just distance. "You already had the conversation," I said. "I'm just responding." My mother reached for my wrist instinctively, the way she always did when she felt control slipping. I stepped back before she could touch me. "I'll take care of the check," my father snapped, embarrassed, now his eyes darting toward the audience they had unintentionally gathered. I picked up the envelope, slid it into my bag, and turned toward the exit. No shouting, no tears, just the quiet certainty of someone who finally understands where they stand. Behind me, I heard my sister hiss something under her breath. I heard my mother calling my name, suddenly panicked. I didn't turn around. When I stepped outside, the night air felt colder, cleaner. My phone buzzed immediately. Messages piling up. I didn't look. What they didn't know, what none of them could see through their carefully staged humiliation, was that those papers didn't end anything. They triggered it. And as I walked away from that restaurant disowned and documented, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Relief. I stood just outside the restaurant doors longer than I meant to, my hand still wrapped around the strap of my bag, the envelope inside pressing against my side like a reminder that hadn't finished speaking yet. Through the glass, I could see them. My parents settling back into their chairs. My sister lifting her phone again, angling it toward the table instead of my face now. The performance hadn't ended. I was simply no longer part of it. Laughter bubbled up from somewhere inside. Not relief laughter, not awkward laughter. Comfortable laughter. The kind that comes when people believe a difficult task has been completed successfully. I heard my father's voice float through the door when someone opened it to leave. My name followed by the word necessary. Necessary. Not painful, not tragic, necessary. That was the moment it stopped hurting. I walked to my car slowly, deliberately, as if speed might suggest panic. Inside, the envelope waited. I placed my bag on the passenger seat but didn't open it again. I already knew what it said. What mattered now was why it had been written weeks ago and presented tonight under chandeliers and watchful eyes. They called it tough love. They always had. In my family, tough love meant obedience framed as wisdom. It meant approval with conditions and affection with footnotes. Love was not something you were given. It was something you earned by aligning yourself with their version of success. My sister had mastered that early. She learned how to nod at the right moments, how to mirror my mother's values, how to speak in a way that sounded independent while never actually straying. She was rewarded for it. Applause, opportunities, protection. I had chosen differently. Not rebelliously, just differently. And for that, I had always been managed. I started the engine, but didn't pull away. I needed to understand the shape of what had just happened, not emotionally, but structurally. This wasn't a family argument. This was a decision, and decisions leave fingerprints. When I finally drove home, my phone buzzed the entire way. Calls, messages, notifications stacking on top of each other. I didn't answer any of them. I parked, went inside, and set the envelope on my kitchen table like evidence waiting to be examined. Alone, without the restaurant lights or the audience, the papers felt even colder. I read them again, line by line. Formal language, clean formatting. Nothing rushed. This wasn't written in anger. It was written in certainty, names typed, not scribbled, dates consistent, clauses carefully ordered. And there it was again. The date. Weeks earlier. My parents hadn't disowned me at dinner. They had finalized it long before and simply chosen the most humiliating moment to deliver it. Graduation, public, celebratory. A perfect contrast for maximum effect. I imagined the conversations I hadn't been part of. The meeting where my future was discussed like a liability. The moment my sister suggested recording it for accountability. The nods of agreement. The quiet satisfaction of believing they were still in control. They believed this was closure. I placed the papers down and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. The shock had worn off completely, now replaced by something sharper. Recognition. This wasn't about money, or embarrassment, or discipline. This was about authority. They had lost their grip on me years ago, and this was their attempt to reassert it permanently. If they couldn't direct my life, they would remove themselves from it, in a way that looked decisive rather than desperate. Tough love, they called it. My phone buzzed again. This time I glanced at the screen. A message from the family group chat. I didn't open it, but I could see the preview. My mother's name followed by a long paragraph. Probably damage control. Probably framed as concern. Probably already being forwarded to extended relatives to establish the official narrative. I didn't respond. Silence had always unsettled them. They mistook it for weakness because they used noise to maintain power. Loud opinions, loud expectations, loud love. I knew better. As the night deepened, individual messages began to break away from the group. A cousin asking if I was okay, an aunt offering vague sympathy without questions. None of them mentioned the word disownment directly. It was as if saying it out loud might make it uglier. One message stood out. It was short, unexpected. You should know this wasn't as unanimous as they're pretending. No name attached, just the number. I stared at it for a long moment before setting the phone back down. I wasn't ready for allies yet. Not because I didn't want them, but because I needed to see how far my parents would go now that they believed the door was closed. They had made assumptions about me that night. Dangerous ones. They assumed I would beg, that I would panic, that I would try to negotiate my way back into a family that had just formally rejected me. They assumed I needed them more than they needed me. They always did. What they didn't understand was that disownment doesn't just remove obligation. It removes permission. Permission to interfere. Permission to advise. Permission to punish. For the first time in my life, I didn't have to explain myself to anyone who shared my last name. I placed the envelope into a drawer not hidden just out of sight. A reminder, not a wound. Then I poured a glass of water and stood by the window watching headlights move along the street below. Somewhere across the city, my parents were probably still at the restaurant, finishing dessert, reassuring each other they'd done the right thing. My sister might have already started editing the footage, trimming out anything that made them look cruel instead of principled. They believed the story was written. What they didn't realize was that by putting everything in writing, by making it official and irreversible in their minds, they had done me a favor. They had drawn a line so clear that there was no temptation to step back over it. I didn't sleep much that night, but not from grief, from awareness, from the quiet recalibration that happens when you stop asking for approval and start measuring leverage. By morning, the envelope no longer felt heavy. It felt final. And in my family, finality had a way of changing who held the power. Morning light spilled across my apartment in thin, deliberate lines, the kind that made everything look calmer than it felt. I woke without the usual jolt of dread, without the instinctive urge to check my phone and brace myself for whatever message might be waiting. The silence was intentional. I left it that way. The envelope sat on my kitchen table exactly where I'd placed it the night before. Flat, neat, unthreatening now. I poured coffee, stood barefoot on the cool tile, and stared at it long enough to notice something I hadn't allowed myself to think about yet. The date. Not just the date on the disownment papers, but the date on something else entirely. It matched. Weeks earlier, in a quiet office far from my parents' orbit, I had signed my name on a different set of documents. No audience, No speeches, no cameras, just ink witnesses and a mutual understanding that what we were formalizing would change the direction of my life. At the time, I hadn't connected the timing. Now I couldn't unsee it. My parents believed I'd been drifting, that I was dabbling, playing at independence while waiting to come to my senses. They thought my life existed in a series of temporary phases that would eventually resolve back into something they recognized and approved. They were wrong. While they were busy measuring my choices against their expectations, I was building something they couldn't see because they never thought to look there. Not out of secrecy, but out of necessity. I'd learned early that visibility invited interference, and interference was their favorite form of love. I sat down and opened my laptop not to check messages, but to ground myself in something real. Files opened, calendars, contracts, evidence of a parallel life that had grown quietly while my family congratulated themselves on managing me. The agreement I'd signed wasn't flashy. No dramatic title, no inflated language. It was precise, clean, and brutally honest about expectations. Responsibilities outlined, authority defined, contingencies accounted for. One clause in particular had stood out to me even then. Activation upon severance of familial control. At the time, I'd smiled at the phrasing, thinking it cautious, maybe even unnecessary. The people who drafted it had seen something I hadn't fully accepted yet. They understood patterns. Families like mine followed them religiously. They'd known this moment would come. The meeting where I signed had been unremarkable on the surface. Neutral office, neutral walls, a table scarred by years of previous negotiations. The people there didn't care about my last name. They didn't ask about my parents or my sister or what I'd studied. They asked what I could do, what I knew, what I was willing to be responsible for. It was the first time I'd felt measured by competence instead of compliance. One of them had leaned back in his chair afterward, studying me with something like approval. You know, he'd said families like yours don't let go easily. I hadn't answered. I didn't need to. You should be prepared, he continued, for the day they decide control matters more than connection. I'd nodded, then filed the comment away as caution, not prophecy. Now standing in my kitchen, it felt less like advice and more like a timeline. My phone buzzed again, this time insistently. I ignored it, not out of avoidance, but out of prioritization. There was nothing my family could say that would change what had already been done, and everything they said now would be an attempt to rewrite intent. I picked up the envelope and slid it back into the drawer. Not hidden, just contained. Then I pulled out a different folder, one I kept in a fireproof box beneath my desk. Thinner, heavier in meaning. 2 sets of papers, one designed to erase, one designed to authorize. The contrast was almost laughable. My parents believed power came from visibility, from knowing everyone's business, from controlling the narrative loudly enough that dissent sounded like betrayal. They assumed that if they couldn't see something, it didn't exist. That assumption had protected me. I hadn't hidden out of fear. I'd built out of distance. Different names on different forms, separate addresses, separate circles, nothing illegal, nothing deceptive, just independent. They had no reason to suspect it because they never believed I was capable of anything without their guidance. That underestimation had become my greatest asset. By mid-morning, the first message from an ally came through. Not the anonymous one from the night before, but someone I trusted implicitly. Someone who knew both sides of my life and had warned me more than once that collision was inevitable. It happened, didn't it? The message read. Yes, I replied. Just that. There was a pause. Then, are you okay? I looked around my apartment. The quiet, the order, the sense of something having finally aligned. I'm ready, I typed back. That was the truth. Not healed, not triumphant, ready. Later, as the day unfolded, more information trickled in without me asking for it. Whispers from circles my parents didn't realize overlapped with mine. Their shock, their certainty that I would reach out, their plans to wait me out. They thought time would soften me. That distance would turn into regret. They didn't know time was already working against them. The clause, the activation, the conditions met without argument or appeal. They believed the papers they handed me closed a door. What they didn't understand was that those same papers unlocked another one entirely. In the afternoon, I took a call from one of the people who'd witnessed my signature weeks earlier. The tone was professional, neutral, respectful. "I assume you're aware," he said carefully, "that the condition has now been satisfied." "I am," I replied. "Then we'll proceed accordingly. No congratulations, no sympathy, just movement." When the call ended, I sat for a long time without doing anything. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because I needed to acknowledge the shift. My parents had spent years telling me I wasn't ready, that I needed more guidance, more oversight, more time. And yet here I was, positioned exactly where I needed to be, precisely because they had decided to cut me loose. I didn't feel anger toward them in that moment. I felt distance, the kind that makes emotions quieter and decisions sharper. By evening, my phone had filled with unanswered messages, family, extended relatives, numbers I didn't recognize. I left them all unopened. Let the silence do its work. They had wanted finality. They had wanted control. They had wanted me small enough to fit back into a role they understood. What they never knew was that I had already signed my way out of their reach. And now, for the first time, the imbalance of information belonged to me. I found out about the meeting the same way I'd learned most important things in my family, by accident, and never directly. A voicemail from a distant relative, hesitant, carefully worded. "I thought you should know," she said, lowering her voice as if my parents might overhear through the phone. "They're all getting together tomorrow. Your parents, your sister, a few others. It sounds serious." She didn't say my name after that. She didn't have to. I stood in my kitchen phone, still pressed to my ear long after the line went dead. The word meeting echoed louder than it should have. In our family, meetings weren't about discussion. They were about alignment, about deciding what story would be told next and who would be written out of it. This one was happening without me. By the afternoon, the details sharpened. Not a dinner, not a casual gathering. A formal meeting scheduled midweek at my parents' house. People invited who had no business weighing in on my life unless something larger was at stake. Lawyers didn't attend family dinners. Accountants didn't bring folders to casual conversations. Whatever this was, it wasn't about mending fences. I imagined the room easily. The long dining table repurposed as a conference surface, papers laid out, water glasses untouched. My father standing at the head, already rehearsing authority. My mother arranging the seating to manage optics. My sister prepared to document everything that mattered and ignore what didn't. They were consolidating. They needed to. Cutting someone off publicly is one thing. Managing the fallout is another. They had a reputation to protect assets, to shield, and a version of events to solidify before questions started coming from the wrong directions. And they were doing it without me because exclusion was the point. I didn't feel offended. I felt confirmed. They were moving faster than expected, which meant fear had already crept in. Calm families don't rush to formalize narratives. Calm families don't need witnesses. That night, my phone buzzed again. A new message. This one came with a name I recognized instantly. "I'll be there at Red. I'll listen. No promises. No sides declared. Just presence." I set the phone down slowly. The meeting would have an observer they hadn't accounted for. Someone who knew how my family operated and wasn't entirely convinced this was the right move. That mattered more than sympathy. The day of the meeting, I kept my schedule deliberately ordinary. Work, emails, a walk during lunch. I didn't hover near my phone. I didn't pace. If I was going to learn something from being cut out, it would be from distance, not desperation. Still, the tension sat under everything like static. Around mid-afternoon, I received a single update. They're being very thorough, the message said. More than they need to be. Thorough meant records, timelines, justifications. It meant they were already preparing defenses for decisions they hadn't made public yet. My parents always confused thoroughness with righteousness. As the meeting stretched on, fragments came through. Not transcripts. Impressions. My father pushed for decisiveness. Finality. He didn't want room for reinterpretation later. He wanted clean lines, closed doors, control restored through permanence. My mother focused on language, how things would sound if repeated, which phrases could soften the story without weakening it. She suggested words like guidance and boundaries instead of punishment and removal. My sister insisted on documentation, minutes taken, agreements summarized. She framed it as protection, accountability, legal prudence. She had always loved paper trails when she wasn't the one being trailed. The assumption underlying all of it was painfully clear. They believed I was on the outside waiting, that I would find out eventually, panic, and come knocking. This meeting was about making sure there would be nothing left to negotiate when that happened. They were wrong about one thing. I wasn't waiting. Late in the afternoon, the tone shifted. The messages slowed. The pauses between updates grew longer. That usually meant disagreement. My father wanted speed. My sister wanted precision. My mother wanted deniability. Those priorities don't align easily. Someone questioned timing. Someone else questioned visibility. The idea of making certain decisions public immediately met resistance. There were concerns about backlash, about how things might look if they moved too fast. Fear again, this time less controlled. One decision they made in that room, one I didn't hear about until much later, would end up accelerating everything, a preventative measure they thought, a way to limit exposure. Instead, it narrowed their options. By early evening, the meeting broke. People left in small clusters, conversations unfinished. My parents stayed behind, no doubt replaying moments, recalculating tone, convincing themselves the plan was sound. My phone buzzed once more. They don't realize what they just did, the message said. But they will. I didn't reply immediately. I stood by the window watching the sky darken the city, settling into its usual rhythms. Somewhere across town, my parents believed they had tightened their grip. What they didn't understand was that meetings like that don't strengthen power. They expose its fractures. For the first time, I wasn't speculating about their intentions. I was watching their structure strain under pressure. Their unity wasn't breaking yet, but it was no longer effortless. That was enough. Later that night, I opened the drawer and took out the envelope again, not to reread it, to weigh it, to remember the confidence with which it had been handed to me, the certainty behind it. They thought cutting me out meant I was no longer in the room. In reality, it meant I could finally see everything clearly. And clarity, I was learning, was far more dangerous than proximity. I found the old envelope while looking for something else. It was wedged between tax documents and instruction manuals, yellowed at the edges. My name typed in a font no one uses anymore. The return address stopped me cold. A place my parents hadn't visited in years. A name they never took seriously. I sat on the floor and opened it carefully, as if the paper itself might object to being disturbed. Inside was a single page and a smaller folded note written in a steady hand I recognized immediately. Not sentimental, not dramatic, just precise. It felt strange to hold proof that someone had seen me clearly, long before my parents decided to erase me. Growing up, my name had always been treated like a placeholder, something temporary, something I would grow out of once I came to my senses. My sister's name was spoken with confidence, with certainty, with expectation. Mine was followed by qualifiers: curious, independent, difficult, promising if redirected. I remembered the way my father used to introduce me at gatherings. "This is my child," he'd say, and then pause as if waiting for applause that never came. My sister never got pauses. She got headlines. The person who wrote that letter never paused. I closed my eyes and let myself remember the first time they'd spoken to me without correction. I had been younger then, restless, already aware that something in my family's structure didn't fit me. They listened, not indulgently, not impatiently. They asked questions that assumed I had answers worth hearing. My parents didn't like them. They said the word with a tight smile, as if dislike were a mild inconvenience rather than a warning. They called them impractical, old-fashioned, out of touch. They minimized their influence the way they minimized anything they couldn't control. They never suspected the long game. The note inside the envelope was brief, a reminder, really. It referenced a conversation from years ago, one I'd assumed had been forgotten by everyone else, even if it hadn't left me. "If you ever find yourself formally excluded," it read, Know that the safeguards are already in place. Follow the instructions. Trust the timing. There was no signature. There didn't need to be. I sat there longer than I should have, the envelope open on my lap, the weight of it pressing into my thoughts. This wasn't nostalgia. It was alignment. Pieces falling into place with an inevitability that felt almost unsettling. Back then, when they'd first spoken to me about protection, I hadn't understood the depth of it. I'd assumed they were being cautious, paranoid even. My parents were difficult, yes, but surely not that predictable. I had underestimated them, just not in the way they underestimated me. My phone buzzed, startling me out of the memory. A message from someone who had known that older relative longer than I had. Someone who'd quietly stepped in after they were gone, making sure certain instructions weren't lost to time. "You found it?" The message read. I didn't ask how they knew. Some people have a way of sensing when a door opens. "Yes," I typed back. "Good. Then you should also know this wasn't meant to hurt them. It was meant to stop them." I read that sentence twice. Stop them. From what I wondered, from punishing, from rewriting history, from using family loyalty as leverage when it suited them and discarding it when it didn't, from doing exactly what they had done at my graduation dinner. I stood and placed the envelope back where I'd found it, but this time I added something else to the folder, a copy of the Disownment papers. Side by side, past and present, finally acknowledging each other. The realization settled in slowly, then all at once. The disownment wasn't just an emotional rupture. It was a trigger. A condition anticipated years ago by someone who understood my parents better than they understood themselves. The timing wasn't cruel. It was exact. Later that afternoon, I drove past my childhood home without stopping. The house looked the same as it always had. Trimmed hedges, fresh paint, everything in its place. My parents loved appearances that suggested stability. They believed maintenance was the same thing as care. I remembered sitting at that kitchen table years earlier, being told my ideas were interesting, but unrealistic. That my ambitions were admirable, but misguided. That I would understand one day why certain paths were discouraged. I understood now. They hadn't been trying to protect me. They had been trying to preserve a system where they remained essential, where approval flowed one way and compliance flowed the other. The older relative had seen through that immediately. They had watched my parents praise control and call it love. They had watched my sister learn the rules and thrive inside them. And they had watched me chafe not because I was rebellious, but because I was incompatible. So they had planned, quietly, carefully, without spectacle. I pulled over and sat in my car, hands resting on the steering wheel, breathing in the familiar smell of upholstery and dust. I thought about how my parents would react when they realized the past had teeth, when they learned that the name they'd dismissed had been legally anchored in places they never bothered to check. Not yet, I reminded myself. Not yet. Power doesn't need to announce itself early. It needs to wait until resistance becomes impossible. That evening, I received another message from the observer at the family meeting. Short, neutral, weighted. They're confident, it said. Too confident. That was the danger of certainty. It blinds you to patterns repeating. I replied with a single word. Understood. I didn't feel joy at the thought of what was coming. I felt steadiness. The kind that comes when you stop questioning your reality and start trusting your preparation. My parents believed the story began the night they handed me those papers. They believed my exclusion was the first decisive move. They were wrong. The story had begun years earlier when someone they underestimated decided to protect the one child they couldn't control. And now, with the trigger pulled by their own hands, that protection was finally waking up. Something shifted before anyone said it out loud. It wasn't dramatic at first. No headlines. No frantic calls. Just small inconsistencies that didn't fit the version of control my parents liked to project. A delayed response where there was usually immediate authority. A meeting rescheduled instead of commanded. Silence where confidence should have been. I noticed it through other people, not them. A colleague who worked adjacent to my family's business mentioned casually that a deal was taking longer than expected. An advisor I barely spoke to asked a question that suggested uncertainty, not strategy. These weren't alarms. They were tremors. By the end of the week, the tremors became patterns. My parents' world was starting to shake, and for the first time, it wasn't because of me. They had always moved through life with the assumption that momentum belonged to them, that problems could be smoothed over with enough pressure, enough reputation, enough carefully placed calls. Watching that assumption fail was unsettling in a way I hadn't anticipated. The issue wasn't a single crisis. It was a convergence, a financial strain they hadn't planned for, a legal review that refused to be rushed, a reputational concern that spread faster than their influence could contain. Each problem fed the next, narrowing their options in real time. What struck me most was the speed. They were used to dictating timelines. Now deadlines were being handed to them. My sister reacted first. She always did when control slipped. She made calls late into the night, sent emails marked urgent, tried to insert herself into conversations that no longer needed her approval. The calm precision she prided herself on started to fracture. My father grew sharper, shorter, less patient. Authority without confidence is loud, and his voice rose accordingly. He pushed for solutions that would have worked a year ago. They didn't land now. My mother focused on appearances as expected. She smoothed, reassured, insisted everything was under control. But her reassurances came too often. They were starting to sound like requests rather than statements. They were afraid. I didn't feel satisfaction watching it unfold. I felt confirmation. This wasn't karma, it was consequence. Their first real mistake under pressure came quietly. They reached for help they would have mocked months earlier. Outside expertise, neutral parties, people who didn't care about their last name or their history. That decision alone told me how serious it had become, because those outsiders didn't answer to them. Through channels they didn't know existed, I began receiving updates. Nothing dramatic, just enough to map the trajectory, where the strain was greatest, where resistance was forming, where their usual leverage failed. They were no longer the strongest presence in the room. What they didn't realize was how close their crisis sat to something I was already part of, not as a cause, not as a savior, but as a point of intersection they hadn't accounted for. The overlap was subtle, intentional, designed that way. One afternoon, my phone rang with a number I recognized immediately. Not family, not an ally, someone professional, someone precise. We're approaching a threshold, they said after a brief greeting. If certain conditions aren't met, decisions will be made without their input. I understood exactly what that meant. They won't like that, I said. They won't be consulted, the voice replied. There's a difference. When the call ended, I sat still for a long moment. This was the point of no return. Not because of revenge, because systems don't reverse themselves once momentum changes hands. My parents still believed they could fix this, that a decisive move or a strategic sacrifice would restore order. They didn't understand that the structure itself had shifted. The outside world was closing in, and reputation wasn't enough to hold it back anymore. By midweek, whispers turned into open concern. Advisors stopped softening their language. Board members asked questions that assumed failure was a possibility. Institutions that had once deferred now demanded documentation. My parents were no longer commanding the room. They were defending it. I heard through one of the quieter channels that my father had slammed his hand on a table during a meeting, that he accused someone of disloyalty for suggesting caution. The word betrayal was used not in reference to me, but to the people he once relied on. Power, when threatened, turns inward. My sister began to unravel next. The controlled strategist couldn't tolerate uncertainty. She pushed too hard, too fast, exposing desperation she didn't know how to hide. The very skills that had once protected her now worked against her. She had always believed proximity to power was the same as possessing it. She was learning the difference. The call that confirmed everything came late one evening. I almost missed it. "They're out of time," my contact said. "If they don't accept external leadership for this next phase, the outcome won't be theirs to choose. And if they do," I asked. There was a pause. Then carefully, "Then they'll still lose control. Just more slowly." I thanked them and ended the call. There it was, the inevitable convergence, the moment I'd been preparing for without fully naming it. My parents needed something now, something they had once dismissed, something tied indirectly to me. They would never ask. They didn't have to. What mattered was that the collision was no longer theoretical. The pressure had reached a point where avoidance was impossible. A meeting would be scheduled. A decision would be announced. Authority would be clarified. And for the first time, they would be reacting instead of directing. I didn't intervene, not yet. Intervening early would have softened the lesson. It would have given them space to reinterpret events in a way that preserved their self-image. I let the situation mature, the way you let a storm gather before it breaks. That night, I stood by my window again, watching the city lights pulse below. Somewhere not far from me, my parents were probably doing the same thing they always did when they felt cornered. Planning, reframing, convincing themselves they still held the advantage. They had spent years believing they were untouchable. Now they were learning what it felt like to need someone they had already discarded. The invitation arrived without ceremony, buried in my inbox between routine updates and calendar reminders. No emotion, no explanation, just a date, a location, and language that made it clear attendance was not optional. My parents had no choice but to be there. The event was framed as a necessary step forward, a corrective measure, a chance to stabilize what had begun to fracture. Public enough to reassure stakeholders, controlled enough to maintain the illusion of authority. They couldn't avoid it without admitting weakness. I recognized the venue immediately. A modern conference center downtown, all glass and steel, designed to look transparent while concealing everything that mattered. I had been there before, months earlier, under very different circumstances. That was when I knew this wasn't coincidence. I arrived early, dressed plainly, carrying nothing that would draw attention. No family colors, no familiar markers. I entered through a side access point, reserved for people whose names didn't appear on the main list. The kind of access my parents never thought about because they assumed power always announced itself. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with quiet urgency. People spoke in lowered voices, eyes flicking toward phones, folders held a little too tightly. This wasn't confidence. It was anticipation, edged with fear. I took my place without being noticed. From where I sat, I could see them clearly. My father paced near the front of the room, jacket still on, tie, loosened in a way meant to suggest casual command. He scanned faces as people entered, nodding when he recognized someone, frowning when he didn't. My mother stood near him, posture immaculate, smile controlled. She greeted people warmly, smoothing edges before they could cut. If anyone noticed her hand trembling slightly when she adjusted her bracelet, they didn't mention it. My sister sat a few rows back, laptop open, fingers already hovering over the keyboard. She was prepared, she always was, prepared to document, to reframe, to protect. None of them looked in my direction. That should have stung. It didn't. I watched them from the other side of the glass they didn't realize existed. Observed how stress altered their movements, sharpened their voices, stripped away the ease they once wore like armor. They were nervous. The meeting began with formalities, introductions, titles, reassurances that everyone was there for the same reason: stability, continuity, resolution. My father spoke first. He always insisted on that. His voice filled the room, confident but brittle around the edges. He outlined challenges, framed setbacks as temporary, emphasized legacy as if it were a shield rather than a liability. People listened, politely, carefully, but they didn't relax. When questions came, they came from directions my parents weren't used to. Precise, inconvenient, unanswered. Each one chipped away at the illusion that this was still their room. My sister typed furiously, glancing up only when something landed particularly hard. Her jaw tightened. She whispered something to my mother, who nodded once, then leaned closer to my father. The dynamics were shifting in real time. At one point, a phrase caught my attention. My father used a word he'd mocked me for years ago, a term he'd dismissed as theoretical when it came from my mouth. Now he wielded it desperately, hoping it would buy credibility. I almost smiled. The person they believed held the real power hadn't spoken yet. A senior intermediary sat calmly near the center of the room, listening, hands folded, eyes sharp. My parents deferred to him instinctively, adjusting their tone whenever he shifted. They thought he was the one who mattered. They didn't know he answered to someone else. There was a moment, brief but electric, when my sister's eyes flicked toward me. Not recognition, just a pause, as if something about my posture or presence brushed against memory. Then she looked away, dismissed. It returned to her screen. Even if she had recognized me, it wouldn't have changed anything. The meeting tightened. Options narrowed. The language grew more urgent, less polished. Deadlines replaced visions. Conditions replaced assurances. My parents agreed to things they would have rejected outright weeks earlier. Concessions disguised as strategy. Control slipping through fingers clenched too tightly. I felt no urge to intervene. This wasn't my role yet. The intermediary finally stood, signaling the transition to the meeting's final segment. The room quieted instantly. This was it. The part everyone had been waiting for, whether they admitted it or not. He spoke about leadership, about accountability, about the need for decisive action guided by experience rather than legacy. His words were measured, deliberate, leaving no space for misinterpretation. My parents leaned forward, hopeful despite themselves. They believed relief was coming, that the hard part was over. I knew better. The intermediary glanced at his notes, then toward a figure seated just outside my parents' line of sight, someone they hadn't bothered to identify because the name wasn't familiar. Me. My pulse didn't change. My breathing stayed even. This wasn't the moment to feel anything. Not yet. He cleared his throat. "There's one final matter," he said, his voice carrying easily. "Before we proceed, authority for this next phase must be formally acknowledged." The room held its breath. My parents straightened. My sister's fingers froze above the keyboard. I didn't move. The intermediary turned slightly and smiled, the smallest shift, the kind that signals inevitability rather than kindness. They thought they were finally meeting their savior. What they didn't know was that I was already in the room, waiting for my name to be called. The room fell into a silence so complete it felt engineered. Chairs stopped shifting, papers stilled. Even the hum of the air system seemed to fade, as if it knew better than to interrupt what was coming. The intermediary stood at the front, hands resting lightly on the table, eyes scanning the room with the calm of someone who already knew the outcome. My parents leaned forward at the same time. Hope does that to people. It synchronizes them. "This next phase," the intermediary said, "requires clarity of authority." My sister's fingers hovered over her keyboard, poised to capture the moment she believed would restore order. My mother's smile tightened, rehearsed, and ready. My father adjusted his jacket, the familiar gesture he used whenever he believed control was about to be returned to him. The intermediary glanced down once more, then looked up. "The final decision-maker," he said evenly, "will be introduced now." He paused just long enough for anticipation to turn into impatience. Then he spoke my name, clearly, precisely, without hesitation. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. The sound didn't register as meaning. It existed as noise detached from consequence. My parents' faces remained expectant, waiting for the explanation that would make sense of what they'd just heard. My sister was the first to react, not emotionally, cognitively. Her eyes narrowed, her head tilting slightly as she replayed the name in her mind, searching for context relevance, any file she might have overlooked. My mother turned halfway toward me, then stopped. Recognition flickered, then confusion drowned it. She smiled again, uncertain now, as if this were a misunderstanding that would correct itself if she just waited. My father didn't turn at all. He stared straight ahead, jaw tightening, convinced this was a procedural error. The intermediary continued, his voice steady. "As Chief Executive Officer for this engagement, they will assume full authority effective immediately." That was when the room moved. Chairs scraped back, heads turned. Conversations died mid-breath. People followed the line of authority, the way iron filings follow a magnet, and suddenly every eye was on me. I stood, not dramatically, not slowly, just enough to acknowledge what had already been decided. The silence shifted from anticipation to shock. My parents' faces changed in stages. Denial first, then calculation, then something darker, heavier, as the implications began to assemble themselves without permission. My mother's hand went to her chest, not theatrically, but reflexively. My sister's laptop closed with a sharp click, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge. My father finally turned, really turned, and looked at me as if I were a stranger wearing my face. "This must be a mistake," he said too loudly. The intermediary didn't look at him. "It isn't," he replied simply. He began listing credentials, not boasting, not praise, facts, roles, decisions already executed. Each sentence tightened the space around my parents, stripping away the possibility of interruption. I said nothing. Letting others define your authority is far more effective than announcing it yourself. My sister found her voice then. "You can't be serious," she said, standing halfway before stopping herself. "This is a conflict. There are ethics involved." The intermediary met her gaze calmly. Those were reviewed, extensively. Her mouth opened, then closed. For the first time in my life, she had no angle to exploit. My father tried again. "We weren't informed of this arrangement. You were informed of the outcome," the intermediary replied. "Your awareness of the process was not required." The words landed hard. Around the room, people began to shift away from my parents subtly but unmistakably. Distance forming where alignment used to be. Power does that. It redraws the room without asking permission. I finally spoke. "Please continue," I said. The intermediary nodded and outlined the terms. Not negotiations, conditions, timelines, consequences for non-compliance, each one publicly binding, each one anchored to decisions my parents had already made days earlier in their attempt to contain the crisis. They were trapped by their own urgency. My mother shook her head, eyes shining now but still careful. "This doesn't make sense," she said softly, turning toward me, as if I might reassure her. "Why are you doing this?" I held her gaze without anger. "I'm not doing anything I said. I'm accepting responsibility." The distinction mattered. My father's composure finally cracked. "After everything we've done for you," he snapped, "forgetting the room, forgetting the audience. You do this to us." A ripple moved through the attendees, not sympathy, discomfort. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lower it either. "You handed me papers in public," I said evenly. "You made your position clear. I respected it." My sister stared at me, eyes searching my face for something familiar, something she could use. "You planned this?" she said quietly. "No," I replied. I prepared for it. There was a difference they had never learned to recognize. The intermediary stepped in again, bringing the focus back to structure. Decisions were finalized, documents distributed, acknowledgments required. People signed where they were told, the sound of pens against paper echoing louder than it should have. My parents sat frozen. When the meeting adjourned, the room erupted into controlled chaos. Calls placed, conversations sparked. People moved quickly now, aligning themselves with the new reality before it could leave them behind. My parents didn't move. I stood there for a moment longer, watching them absorb the truth they had tried to avoid for years. That authority isn't inherited. It's granted by systems they no longer controlled. My mother finally stood and reached for me, stopping short when she realized how inappropriate the gesture was now. "We need to talk," she said, voice trembling. "There will be time," I replied. "Later. Not now. Not here." My father said nothing. He looked older than I remembered, smaller. The certainty he wore like armor had been stripped away in a single announcement. As I walked toward the exit, people parted instinctively, not out of fear, out of recognition. At the door, I paused and looked back once, not to gloat, to acknowledge the finality of the shift. When my name was called, their world didn't end. It simply stopped belonging to them. The room didn't empty all at once. It fractured. Clusters formed and dissolved, conversations overlapping in low, urgent tones. Phones came out. Doors opened and closed. The kind of controlled chaos that follows a public shift in power. People moved quickly, recalibrating loyalties in real time. My parents stayed seated long after the meeting officially ended. From a distance, they looked composed. Too composed. The kind of stillness that comes when someone is trying to keep a collapse contained behind their ribs. My sister paced near the wall phone, pressed to her ear, her voice sharp and urgent, already trying to stitch together damage control. I didn't approach them. Not yet. Letting silence stretch after a reveal is just as important as the reveal itself. Outside the room, the consequences began stacking faster than anyone could track. Advisors demanded clarification. Partners requested assurances. Questions that had once been deferred were now being asked openly without apology. My parents' authority had been punctured in public. That kind of wound doesn't bleed immediately, it spreads. My sister was the first to break formation. She crossed the room quickly and intercepted me near the exit, lowering her voice as if proximity might restore familiarity. "We need to talk," she said, breathless. "Now!" Her eyes were wide, scanning the hallway behind me, already aware that privacy was a luxury she no longer controlled. "This isn't the place," I replied. Her jaw tightened. "This is a misunderstanding," she insisted. "We can fix this." "Fix," the word she used whenever something slipped beyond her planning. I looked at her, then really looked at her, the woman who had always thrived inside our parents' structure now unraveling as it rejected her along with them. "There's nothing to fix," I said. "The process is already moving." She opened her mouth to argue, then stopped when a man in a tailored suit stepped between us, nodding politely in my direction before turning to her. "They're waiting for you," he said, not asking, informing. She stared at him, then at me, something close to fear flashing across her face before she turned away. My parents approached next together this time. My mother first, as always. Her expression had softened into something she likely believed was maternal concern. My father followed half a step behind his face, rigid, his eyes sharp with calculation. "Can we speak privately?" my mother asked. Her voice shook just enough to be convincing. I glanced at the people moving around us, the glass walls, the open doors. Nothing here was private anymore. "Later," I said again. My father exhaled sharply. "You blindsided us," he said low and controlled. "That wasn't necessary." I met his gaze evenly. Neither was the dinner. His face flushed. My mother placed a hand on his arm, a gesture meant to restrain him but also to signal unity. "That was never meant to be permanent," she said quickly. "We were trying to protect you." The lie was so familiar it barely registered. "You put it in writing," I replied. "You made it public." "That doesn't mean we can't correct it," my sister called from across the room, having circled back, desperation overriding caution. "We can explain. Say it was symbolic disownment. The absurdity would have been funny if it weren't so revealing." I shook my head. "Intent doesn't change outcome." My father's voice hardened. "You're enjoying this?" "No," I said. "I'm accepting reality." They looked at me as if I'd spoken a foreign language. The pressure around them intensified as more people approached conversations, halting mid-sentence when they realized who now stood at the center of gravity. My parents were being isolated without anyone ever saying the word. This was panic, not loud, not messy. Contained, but undeniable. Within hours, the narrative they had controlled for years began slipping through their fingers. News traveled faster than explanations. The version of events they'd rehearsed no longer mattered once others started asking their own questions. And questions were everywhere. By evening, the first formal notices arrived, reviews initiated, agreements paused, oversight imposed, each one polite, each one non-negotiable. My parents retreated into private spaces they no longer owned. My sister stopped calling and started texting her messages shorter, less certain. "We need to talk. Please, this is getting out of hand." I didn't respond. That night I received a call from someone I trusted, someone who had been quiet until now. "They're opening a review," they said. "Full scope." I closed my eyes briefly. Because of the meeting, because of everything the voice replied, and because of something else. What? The disownment papers. The words landed heavier than I expected. They triggered it. The voice continued. "The condition we discussed years ago, it's active now." I felt a slow, steady calm settle in my chest, the kind that comes when inevitability finally steps into the light. "Are they aware?" I asked. "Not yet." I exhaled slowly. "They will be. They will." The voice agreed. "Soon." I ended the call and stood by the window watching the city lights flicker below. Somewhere out there, my parents were scrambling, trying to regain footing on ground that no longer recognized them. They were begging me to forget the papers they handed me, to pretend the dinner had been a misunderstanding, to restore the order that had always favored them. What they didn't know was that those same papers had already unlocked something far worse, something that didn't require my permission, and once activated, it wouldn't be silenced by apologies. The call came the next morning exactly when I expected it, not early enough to feel urgent, not late enough to feel avoidant. The timing was deliberate, professional, stripped of emotion. When I answered, the voice on the other end didn't ask how I was doing or whether I was prepared. It didn't need to. "We're confirming that the condition has been satisfied," the voice said. "Proceeding now." I closed my eyes briefly and leaned back in my chair. "Understood." There was a pause, then a soft shuffle of papers. "You should be aware," the voice continued, "that once this step is finalized, there is no mechanism for reversal." "I'm aware," I said. That was the end of the conversation. No congratulations, no reassurance, just the quiet click of a process moving forward without anyone asking how it felt. My parents still believed the disownment letter was the center of this story, the dramatic piece, the emotional weapon. They thought it was the most consequential document they had ever signed. It wasn't. Years ago, long before the graduation dinner, long before my name became something they said with frustration instead of pride, another document had been drafted. Not in secret, not hidden, simply ignored. They had known it existed. They just never read it closely. At the time, it had seemed like a formality, something put in place by someone who understood my family's habits better than they ever admitted. A safeguard, a contingency, protection against manipulation dressed up as love. The document was clear in its intent. It didn't punish, it prevented. It assumed that one day control would matter more to my parents than connection. That exclusion would be used not as consequence, but as leverage. It anticipated the exact language they used, the exact steps they took. Formal removal, written declaration, public acknowledgement, all of it. The triggering condition wasn't emotional abandonment, it was procedural exclusion. Once I was formally removed from the family structure, they controlled authority shifted automatically. No debate, no appeal. My parents believed intent mattered, that if they explained themselves well enough, if they framed the disownment as temporary or symbolic, the consequences could be softened. The document didn't care about intent, it cared about action. By the time the call ended, the machinery was already moving. Notifications sent, filings prepared, oversight transferred, everything done quietly, efficiently, without spectacle. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't need to. They would find out the same way I had found out about so many things in my life, indirectly, through a voice that wasn't mine. The architect of the safeguard had once explained it to me in simple terms. Families like yours, they said, don't respond to confrontation. They respond to structure. At the time, I hadn't fully understood. Now, I did. This wasn't revenge. It was correction. The document didn't strip my parents of dignity. It stripped them of leverage. Authority that had gone unchecked for decades was redistributed, not seized. Control moved away from those who used it punitively and toward systems that demanded accountability. My parents could no longer decide who mattered and who didn't. They could no longer rewrite the past to justify the present. They could no longer threaten exclusion as a form of discipline. One clause in particular ensured that reconciliation couldn't be used as a backdoor, even if they apologized, even if they begged, even if they publicly reversed their position. Once activated, the document stood on its own. By midday, the confirmation arrived, finalized, filed, acknowledged. I sat at my desk and stared at the screen longer than necessary, not because I was uncertain, but because I wanted to mark the moment. There are points in a life where something shifts permanently, whether you celebrate it or not. This was one of them. My phone rang shortly after. My mother. I let it ring. Then my father. Then my sister. The pattern was familiar. Escalation through proximity. If one voice failed, they sent another. If authority failed, they tried emotion. I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I took a walk. Outside. Into the afternoon air. The world felt unchanged, indifferent in the way only truth can be. Cars passed. People laughed. Someone argued loudly into a phone on the corner. Life continued. When I returned, there was a message waiting, not from family, from someone who had been part of the process from the beginning. "They've been notified," the message read. I exhaled slowly and typed back, "Thank you." I imagined my parents receiving the news, the disbelief, the scramble, the sudden realization that this wasn't a misunderstanding or a negotiation tactic. This was law. They would search for someone to blame, each other, me, anyone but themselves. They would replay the dinner, the meeting, the words they used trying to find the moment they could have changed the outcome. They would miss the point entirely. The outcome wasn't decided at the graduation table. It was decided years earlier when someone saw what was coming and chose preparation over confrontation. That evening, I finally listened to the voicemail my mother had left earlier. Her voice was strained, careful, threaded with disbelief. "We need to talk," she said. "This has gone too far." Too far. I deleted the message. The disownment papers they handed me had been meant to erase my place in the family, to remind me that belonging was conditional, temporary, revocable. In truth, they were the final signature needed to take control out of their hands forever, and once the system recognized that there was nothing left to argue about. The noise faded faster than I expected. A few days after everything became official, the constant ringing stopped. The urgent messages slowed, then disappeared entirely. The chaos that had followed the announcement retreated behind closed doors, handled by lawyers, administrators, and systems that didn't care about feelings. For the first time since the graduation dinner, my phone sat untouched on the table for hours at a time. It was strange how quiet power could be once it settled. I was called into a meeting midweek not as a formality, but as a choice. A review of what now fell under my authority, what I could claim, what I could restructure, what I could dissolve entirely if I wanted to. The scope surprised even me. Access, decision-making rights, oversight of assets that had once been wielded like weapons, the ability to redirect, reassign, and redefine things my parents had treated as extensions of themselves. No one framed it as revenge. No one framed it emotionally at all. It was presented the way power always is once it becomes legitimate. Calmly, neutrally, as a series of options. "You're entitled to all of it," one advisor said almost casually. "There's no obligation to preserve anything in its current form. All of it." The words lingered long after the meeting ended. On the walk home, I replayed them over and over, not with excitement, but with weight. Because taking everything would have been easy. Legally clean, justified. No one would have questioned it. But ease had never been the same thing as right. I sat at my kitchen table that night with a notepad and wrote 2 lists. What I could take. What I actually needed. The first list was long. The second was precise. There was a difference between restoring balance and becoming the thing that had hurt me. Between reclaiming autonomy and inflicting loss simply because I could. Power doesn't test you when you don't have a choice. It tests you when you do. The next morning, I made my decisions. Some things were restructured immediately, control removed from places where it had been abused, safeguards reinforced, authority redistributed so no one person could use it the way my parents had used it on me. Other things I left untouched, not because they deserved protection, but because I no longer needed to prove anything through destruction. When the confirmations came through, they were simple. Adjustments made, instructions acknowledged, boundaries enforced. One advisor raised an eyebrow as we reviewed the final list. "You could have gone further," they said. "I know," I replied. They nodded, understanding exactly what that meant. My parents tried one last time, not through intermediaries, not through formal channels, directly. My mother called first. I didn't answer. Then my father. Then my sister sent a message that was longer than anything she'd written before, paragraphs stacked on top of each other, logic tangled with emotion. They asked for a meeting, a private one, somewhere neutral. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Not because I owed them anything, but because I wanted to be certain of my decision. We met in a quiet office space I didn't associate with them. No family photos, no familiar power dynamics, just 4 chairs and a table. They arrived together sitting close as if proximity might restore unity. My mother spoke first, of course. "We never meant for things to go this far," she said, eyes glossy but alert. "We were trying to help." My father nodded beside her. "You misunderstood our intentions." I didn't interrupt. I let them speak until they ran out of words. When the silence settled, my sister leaned forward. "You don't have to do this," she said. "You can stop it. You can fix it. Fix it." The same word again. "There's nothing broken," I said calmly. "There's just a new structure." My mother reached across the table, then stopped herself halfway, her hand hovering in the space between us. "We're family," she said softly. "That has to mean something." It did, just not what she wanted it to mean. "I've already decided what I'm taking," I said, "and what I'm not." My father's jaw tightened. "You're leaving us with nothing." I shook my head. "I'm leaving you with exactly what you built, just without control over me." They stared at me as if I were speaking in riddles. "You can apologize," my sister said quickly. "We can apologize. We can make a statement. Say we were wrong." "That won't change anything," I replied. "Why not?" my mother asked, her voice breaking. "Because forgiveness doesn't require access. Because healing doesn't require proximity. Because love doesn't mean surrendering yourself to people who only value you when you comply." I didn't say any of that out loud. "I'm not punishing you," I said instead. "I'm choosing distance." The words landed harder than any accusation. They tried again. Different angles, softer voices, sharper logic, appeals to history, to sacrifice, to the idea of family as obligation. I listened. I always had. But this time I didn't bend. When the meeting ended, they left together quieter than when they arrived. Smaller, not defeated, just finally outside the center of the story. I sat alone for a few minutes after they were gone, breathing in the stillness. There was no triumph in it, no satisfaction, only clarity. In the days that followed, my life began to reorganize itself naturally. New routines, new priorities, decisions made without fear of disapproval or retaliation. The absence of constant judgment was more freeing than any authority I now held. I didn't take everything from them. I took back what should have never been taken from me in the first place. Weeks passed before I noticed how completely the noise had disappeared. Not the absence of sound exactly, the absence of tension. No waiting for a phone to vibrate, no bracing myself before opening an email, no quiet calculation about how a decision might be received by people who believed they were entitled to approve it. Life didn't become dramatic in its freedom. It became simple. My mornings settled into a rhythm that belonged only to me. Coffee without interruption. Work that moved forward without someone questioning my judgment. Evenings that ended without replaying conversations in my head, wondering which version of myself I was supposed to be the next day. For years, I had mistaken pressure for purpose. I thought the constant push meant I mattered. Now I understood how wrong that was. Freedom didn't announce itself with fireworks. It arrived quietly the way relief does when you stop holding your breath and don't realize how long you'd been doing it. One afternoon, while sorting through old files, I found a photo from the graduation dinner. Someone else had taken it, posted it online, forgotten about it. My parents smiling stiffly, my sister leaning in close, me seated between them, unaware of what was waiting in that envelope. I studied my face in the image. Calm, expectant, still trying to belong. I didn't feel anger looking at it. I felt distance, the kind you feel when you recognize someone you used to be but no longer need to defend. That night had hurt. I wouldn't pretend otherwise. Being publicly rejected by the people who raised you doesn't disappear just because you regain control later. Pain doesn't evaporate because justice shows up on time. But pain changes shape when it's no longer reinforced. I realized something then. The dinner wasn't the end of my place in the family. It was the end of my need for their permission, the end of waiting for validation that was never coming. They had needed that moment, needed to prove something to themselves, needed to believe they were still the ones deciding who mattered. I didn't need to prove anything back. I never sent my parents a final message, never delivered a speech, never explained my reasoning in a way that might make them feel absolved. Closure didn't require an audience. I carried my final message in the choices I made afterward. I didn't reach out. I didn't retaliate. I didn't attempt to rebuild something that had always been conditional. Distance wasn't punishment. It was alignment. Occasionally, I'd hear fragments, through other people, through rumors softened by time, my parents adjusting to a smaller world, my sister redefining herself without proximity to power she never truly owned. I wished them no harm. I simply didn't make room for them anymore. The strangest part was how little space they occupied in my thoughts once the structure changed. When control disappears, obsession fades with it. I began traveling more, not to escape but to explore. Places I'd postponed because they weren't practical enough. Decisions I'd delayed because they didn't fit into someone else's plan. I found myself laughing more easily, sleeping more deeply, trusting my instincts without immediately questioning whether they were inconvenient. This, I realized, was what freedom felt like. Not dominance, not revenge, ownership of my own life. Sometimes late at night, I'd think back to the moment I stood up from that restaurant table. How steady my hands had been. How calm my voice sounded when everything around me was designed to provoke collapse. I hadn't known then where the path would lead. I'd only known I wasn't willing to shrink anymore. If you're listening to this and something about it feels uncomfortably familiar, I want you to hear this clearly. Being excluded doesn't always mean you failed. Sometimes it means you outgrew a system that required you to stay small. Being written off doesn't mean you're powerless. It often means someone is afraid of what you'll become without their control. And walking away with dignity is not weakness. It's one of the strongest decisions you can make. I didn't win because I outplayed them. I won because I stopped playing their game. They thought taking my name away would make me disappear. What it actually gave me was the freedom to finally become myself. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been underestimated by the people who were supposed to support you? Have you ever walked away quietly and realized later it was the bravest thing you'd ever done? Share your experience in the comments. You're not alone in it. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about quiet strength, dignity, and justice that doesn't need to shout, consider staying with the channel. Subscribe and be part of a space where these stories are told honestly. Sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't destruction. It's living well on your own terms.